Cátedra Internacional de Opinión Pública presenta Wrongs and Rights, Polling in the 2020 US Elections. La Cátedra Internacional de Opinión Pública, WEI por WAP, da a ustedes la más cordial bienvenida a esta sesión del Seminario de Opinión Pública correspondiente al semestre enero-junio de 2021. Hoy la cátedra magistral lleva por título Wrongs and Rights, Polling in the 2020 US Elections y estará a cargo del Dr. Michael Wagner, profesor de la Escuela de Periodismo y Comunicación de Masas de la Universidad de Wisconsin en Madison. Para iniciar este evento, cedemos la palabra al Dr. Hernando Rojas, director de la Escuela de Periodismo y Comunicación de Masas de la Universidad de Wisconsin.
Buenas tardes a todos, a todas. Bienvenidos a la Cátedra de Opinión Pública. Como dijeron en la presentación, soy Hernando Rojas, soy parte del comité académico. Y quiero empezar por decir que por una parte es muy triste para nosotros reunirnos hoy sin la presencia de José Antonio Meyer. Nos hace una falta enorme. Nos reconforta que su proyecto siga adelante y que la cátedra siga adelante. Hoy tenemos un invitado muy especial, el doctor Michael Wagner, de la Universidad de Wisconsin, como ya se dijo, quien nos va a hablar del proceso electoral del año pasado en Estados Unidos. Tiene un PhD en Ciencia Política de la Universidad de Indiana y en la Universidad de Wisconsin dirige nuestro Centro para la Comunicación y la Renovación Cívica. Él es un experto en temas electorales y de opinión pública, así es que bienvenido, profesor Wagner.
Michael W. Wagner, doctor en Ciencias Políticas por la Universidad de Indiana, director del estudio Elecciones del Congreso en la Universidad de Indiana y moderador en la Universidad de Delaware del debate televisado entre los candidatos al Senado estadounidense, Tom Carper y Jan Thing. Profesor en Ciencias Políticas y en Periodismo y Comunicación de Masas durante varios años en la Universidad de Nebraska en Lincoln. Sus proyectos de investigación incluyen estudios sobre los efectos de las encuestas sobre los medios hostiles y los exámenes de las orientaciones del pensamiento mágico en las actitudes de los medios. El encuadre partidista de los medios de comunicación sobre el electorado. Cómo la gente conecta sus puntos de vista religiosos con sus preferencias políticas. Las consecuencias públicas de la difamación política en la política y los medios. La influencia de las encuestas en la opinión pública, la redistribución de distritos y la representación, los de contenido de marca y el establecimiento de la agenda en la era digital, todos ellos con destacados especialistas. Actualmente, es profesor en la Escuela de Periodismo y Comunicación de Masas de la Universidad de Wisconsin en Madison, donde dirige The Observatory, laboratorio especializado en estudios de opinión pública y redacción de opinión a partir de perspectivas como la comunicación política, partidos políticos, periodismo, opinión pública, psicología política, comportamiento político, religión, política, presidencia y biología. De igual forma, el profesor Wagner participa en 4 importantes proyectos de investigación, más allá de la división izquierda-derecha, cómo el carácter multidimensional de las preferencias políticas de masas afecta a la política estadounidense. Ecología de los medios de Wisconsin en el siglo XXI. Antecedentes de la cobertura de noticias a través de encuestas de periodistas estadounidenses que cubren la política. Y fisiología y efectos de la comunicación.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias y buenas tardes a todos y todas. I'm really happy to be here with all of you today and to share a little bit of what kind of the broader polling community in the United States is concluding about the 2020 elections, and then also to share a little bit of data from Wisconsin in particular, a state that was called correctly, but not by much as we kind of consider how the state of polling can be interpreted in light of the election that we just had. So Our goal for the next little bit of time is to share with you some data at the presidential, Senate, and House levels nationally in the United States, and then do a little bit of a dive into Wisconsin in particular, and then to respond to your comments and questions, where I think we'll do the most learning together today. With that, a big question coming into the 2020 presidential campaign season was, would we see something like we saw in 2016, where not only was the prediction about the winner wrong, but it was wrong in a way that seemed to surprise most observers, even those who understood what it meant to say that Hillary Clinton had a 75% chance of winning. Even those who understand probability were still, I think, quite surprised by the results of the 2016 elections in the United States. And many headlines immediately after the election in 2020 began asking similar questions. Why were the polls so wrong? Why did the polls undercount Trump supporters and the like? And if you look here at the screenshot here with all the maps is from the website 538. This is the final prediction they made on election day. They predicted a Biden win, which of course is what happened, but not one of these maps on the screen actually reflects what happened. All of these maps are wrong in terms of how the actual result ended up. A couple of these maps come close. For example, in the very first column in the third row, Florida and North Carolina, in the Southeast and East Coast, were states that did not go to Joe Biden, but that was a fairly close map. The one right next to it, the third row, second column, is almost right, but it gives Florida and Ohio to Joe Biden, which he did not win. And one over gives Georgia, but again, Carolina and Florida, which again, and Ohio, which Biden did not win. And so despite aggregating together polls across the country, despite an increased number of statewide polls to help correct some of the problems that took place in 2016, not one of these predictions actually ended up being the one that explained the final result in the 2020 election. Once again, as was the case in 2016, the averaged polls got the winner of the popular vote correct. But once again, there was also an overshoot of the estimation for how many votes Joe Biden would end up with as compared to Donald Trump. And so this is just data from Real Clear Politics. Their average had Joe Biden up by just over 7 percentage points, 7.2 is his advantage up to the election. And the spread was much narrower. The Real Clear data stopped updating about a week after the election. As all the votes were counted, this actually got even a little bit, these numbers changed a little bit more. In general, what was wrong and right was a systematic favorability of Joe Biden. It wasn't that the polls were wrong in multiple directions. It was that consistently the evidence, this is shared generously by Charles Franklin of Marquette University in Wisconsin, was essentially that the polls were too favorable to Joe Biden. And this was the case across, whether you're thinking about the Republican vote minus the Democratic vote on the x-axis, or the y-axis, the Republican vote minus the Democratic vote percent, or from the polls on the y-axis to the vote on the x-axis. And you can see there's just a systematic favorability to Biden in these polls that didn't quite match up to what it was that ended up happening on election day, and with all of the early voting that took place before election day. Is this unique? Not really. This data from Panagopoulos and Endres shows that in terms of the overall Democratic and Republican bias in polling as compared to the result, where a 0 would be your optimal score, since 1996, this varies quite a bit. It doesn't seem to vary systematically in any direction. The two largest errors were 1996 and 2020. In 96, of course, there were 3 candidates who received a substantial number of votes: the Republican challenger Bob Dole, the Democratic President Bill Clinton, and also Ross Perot, who was running for a second time as a third-party candidate. And so that was a year when there was more bias to Bill Clinton than ended up being the case. And it was kind of written off as well. There were 3 candidates in the race. And so maybe that is helping to explain this difference. But 2020 was sort of the largest except for 1996. But the bias doesn't seem to go in any particular direction. A Republican bias in 2000 when George W. Bush lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College. Slight Democratic bias in 2004, but the Republican Bush won. Slight Democratic bias in 2008, but Obama won. Slight Republican bias in 2012, but Democrat Obama wins. Slight Democratic bias in 2016, but the Republican wins. Democratic bias in 2020, but the Democrat wins. And so it's not the case that the polling bias gives us the wrong winner in a systematic way, and it's not the case that one side is systematically benefiting from the bias. We see something that varies pretty differently year by year. Even if we go back to 1972, aggregated national polling is not getting worse. If you take the error of the elections in 2008 to 2020 and add them up, you get an error of 10 from the final average to the result. If you take the first 4 years in this data set from 1972 to 1984 and add them up, you get 10. So you'd have the same average across the first 4 years and the last 4 years of our 2 different ways of thinking about time and polling averages. And again, there's not a systematic bias that one particular party continues to do better or worse than their polling results suggest. In 1980, Republicans outperform, and Ronald Reagan does much better than initially predicted. Whereas in other years, the Democrat, like in '76, Jimmy Carter did a little bit better than was predicted. And in 2004 and 2008, the averages were right on the money, which probably contributed quite a bit to the popularity of poll aggregation and sites like 538. But the overall punchline is that since 1972, so for almost 50 years, polling is not getting more inaccurate at the national level. Of course, in the United States, since the Electoral College is what decides the presidency, it's state polling in swing states that really matters the most. And we did see there were some big misses in 2020 at the state level. And a couple of misses are unique to congressional districts. And so part of the polling inaccuracy is also related to the way in which the United States structures its elections. And so in 48 states, the winner of the state gets that state's electoral votes, but in Maine, abbreviated ME at the top of this figure, and in Nebraska, abbreviated NE at the bottom of the figure, both of those states award their electoral votes in 2 ways. You get 2 electoral votes for winning the state, and then you get 1 electoral vote for each congressional district in that state that you win. And the Nebraska 2nd was a district that went in a different direction than the state popular vote in Nebraska. So Joe Biden wins the Nebraska 2nd and gets 1 electoral vote. Donald Trump wins the rest of Nebraska and the other 2 congressional districts, getting 4 electoral votes. And so the big miss was in the congressional district in Maine, the 2nd district, where it looked like Joe Biden was going to win and in fact lost by 8. But that's in a 1 congressional district, which is harder to poll because districts do not respect county lines. They do not respect zip codes. They do not respect calling prefixes. And so it's harder to measure data in congressional districts, especially because many Americans do not know, in fact, most Americans do not know the congressional district that they live in. So even if a conscious pollster was trying to figure out where are you in Maine, which district are you in, people are less likely to know that. On the other hand, in Maine and Nebraska, where congressional districts are more relevant in presidential elections, citizens are more likely to know which district they live in. So there's a little bit of a push and a pull when we look at the results of Maine and Nebraska. In terms of states, it seems though that the biggest misses were in states that either were predominantly white, like Wisconsin and Iowa and Michigan, or states that have a growing Hispanic, Latina population, like Florida. Florida was one that was actually called incorrectly. Biden had the polling average lead, but lost the state. And so that in particular was one of the bigger misses in 2020, whereas many of the other states came much closer to the final result. Many other close, dramatic states like Pennsylvania, Arizona, North Carolina, Virginia, Minnesota, all were within 2 to 2.5 points, really, of the result based on the polling average and how Biden ended up winning. Some of these differences seem to be systematic problems for particular states. And so the figure on the left is showing the gap between the polling average in the last week of the election and the actual election result in both 2020 and 2016. And so on the left, you see states where Biden had a lead, but barely won, Wisconsin being one of those states where he won by less than a percentage point, but had a 7.5-point lead in the polls. Mirroring in many ways what happened in 2016. And in fact, the difference, 7.4 to 6.9, about a half a point, is about what he won by in Wisconsin and what Hillary Clinton lost by in Wisconsin in 2016. And so that miss happened twice, and both in the same direction. The same kind of goes for Michigan, where the polling was on Hillary Clinton's side, but she narrowly lost. And the polling was slightly less advantageous for Biden, and he ended up winning. And the same goes for Pennsylvania. So those three big states, the ones that the Democrats really spent their advertising dollars in the most, and really were focusing on from a party building perspective, were states they were able to flip in 2020, and all three of them were states that they were predicted to win but lost in 2016. On the other hand, states that showed a tight race where Trump won, you had two states that where the result might have been a surprise, Florida especially, and then Ohio, which was really a kind of a toss-up according to the aggregated polling, but in fact, just as it was in 2016, was a comfortable win for Donald Trump, and then the same for Iowa. So it seems as though in the last two election cycles, Ohio and Iowa have been treated as swing states, but are really have moved to a more comfortable Republican category. Places that went well tended to be more in the South and in the Southwest. That doesn't necessarily mean that accurate polling still predicted the correct winner. Joe Biden predicted to win North Carolina, but lost. But the narrow range that the polling was off wasn't very large. And then the same for Georgia, but in the other direction, where Donald Trump was predicted to win a narrow victory, but lost, had a narrow defeat. And so that's really the only example where Trump lost a state that the polling suggested that he was going to win. But again, the difference there is very small. And so these were relatively accurate, even though the thing that you're trying to predict in terms of a winner didn't always quite happen in the same way. One prominent explanation for why this is happening is the suggestion that some of Donald Trump's voters are willing to engage in public opinion surveys, but are not willing to tell people that they want to vote for Donald Trump. And so the argument for a shy Trump voter has been offered both in 2016 and 2020 as a reason for why in some of these states the polling was off. And one reason that became so prominent, for example, in 2016, was you had a state in Wisconsin where there was also a Senate race, and the results for the Republican who won the Senate race were a little bit different than the results for President Trump, who also won Wisconsin. And so there were some arguments there that, well, maybe what's happening is some voters are willing to engage in surveys, but not willing to tell us the truth about who it is they want to vote for. In 2020, it just does not seem to be that is a reasonable explanation for why the polling systematically undersold Donald Trump's performance in the general election. And one reason we think that is when we look at all of the different Senate races, there are usually about 33 or 34 Senate races in each election cycle as the Senate staggers their 6-year terms when folks run for re-election in the Senate out of the 100 US senators. We see the pre-election polling from each state lined up with the actual share of the vote that Donald Trump got in each state. And the Senate polls just didn't really capture Republican loyalty. It undersold Republican loyalty. There was a lot of money spent thinking that Mitch McConnell could be defeated in Kentucky, even though he won comfortably. There was a lot of money spent in Maine, thinking that Susan Collins would be defeated, and she won. And so really Republican loyalty was undersold across the board. It wasn't just a Trump effect. It seems unlikely that someone would be a shy Trump voter and a shy Susan Collins voter, or a shy Trump voter and a shy Lindsey Graham voter in South Carolina, for example. And especially the case with the candidate in South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, who had kind of vacillated between being a Trump critic and a Trump friend over multiple times, and sometimes in both directions in the same week during all of President Trump's service in his term as president. And so the communication strategies offered by these senators didn't necessarily lend itself to a shy Trump voter explanation. And the same is true as we just look at votes across the 435 House districts across the country, looking at elections in 2000, in each presidential election up to 2020. One thing that is clear is just that there's an increasingly tight correlation between the House vote and the presidential vote. And as was the case in 2020, where Donald Trump's overall support was undercounted at the national level and in some key swing states, it was also the case that some House races were similarly underestimated and in the same direction. So again, Republicans performed better in House races than initially forecasted to do, just as Donald Trump performed better in some of the polling than he was forecasted to do, just as Republican Senate candidates performed better in the polling as they were than they were forecasted to do. And so we see a consistent Republican underestimation of vote across all three different kinds of offices. And these offices are very different in terms of their orientation. Of course, the president is the center of the political universe and the center of political news coverage in the United States. But members of the House of Representatives tend to be pretty favorably evaluated by their own constituents. And members of the Senate really vary quite widely. And you have states like Hernando's and I in Wisconsin, where one of the most conservative members of the Senate and one of the most liberal members of the Senate are both from the state of Wisconsin. And so Senate races are often harder to predict, and the staggered nature in which they exist also sometimes make them harder to interpret in concert with presidential results. But in this case, we see the same story across all three elections: the presidential, the Senate, and the House. One other factor that's been described as a possibility for helping us understand why polling might have been off was the role of early voting and what that played in this election. Many states and the Democratic Party in general really pushed their voters to bank their votes as early as possible. And what you see here is the early vote as a percentage of the total vote in each state in 2016. And so, for example, Hawaii eclipsed its overall voting in 2016 just with the early vote in 2020, and Texas did as well. So did Washington, Montana, Colorado almost got there, Oregon almost got there, New Mexico, Nevada, North Carolina. You might notice that I'm naming a lot of swing states: Nevada, North Carolina, and you might notice I'm naming other states that were thought to be in contention, such as Texas and Arizona and Georgia, Florida. All these states had large early votes, and so one of the problems may well have been a difficulty in sampling with respect to knowing who banked their vote in a sample, and then knowing who was still out there claiming to be a likely voter, but not someone who'd already gone and cast their ballot. So this is another potential explanation that we'll look at in just a second. And so to kind of do that and to do a little bit of a dive, I want to show you some different kinds of data from our state in Wisconsin. And first, one thing to note is just there's been a pretty considerable evolution in the presidential vote. And so just looking at 2004, So there it's John Kerry, the Democrat, against then President George W. Bush seeking re-election in a narrow win for John Kerry, the Democrat, in Wisconsin, but a narrow win for George W. Bush nationally. In 2020, a narrow win for Joe Biden. But you can see Biden has won way fewer counties in Wisconsin than John Kerry did, but he won by roughly the same margin as Kerry did 16 years earlier. And so one thing that's happening in Wisconsin that we also think is happening in Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania in particular are that rural areas are becoming more strongholds for Republicans, and urban areas are becoming more strongholds for Democrats. And that has implications for how we think about engaging in public opinion polling. And so, for example, the center I direct, the Center for Communication and Civic Renewal at UW-Madison, we did pre and post-election surveys in Wisconsin, Ohio, Georgia, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Michigan, I think that's everything, and North Carolina in 2018 and 2020, and are finding that the sampling frame is difficult when it comes to the increasing concentration of Democratic votes in urban areas and the increasing concentration of Republican votes in rural areas where it's harder to find folks to be willing to engage in public opinion surveys. And so the shy Trump voter does not seem to be the explanation, but the Republican voter who is not willing to participate in a survey does seem to be a part of the problem, especially Republican voters who live in more rural areas. And that can be Republican voters, whether they are white Republican voters or especially Hispanic, Latina Republican voters who often sometimes will live in rural areas and engage in agricultural work. We seem to be undercounting both groups, and they both tend to be supporting, at least in 2020, the party of the same candidate. So one thing we tried to do here in Wisconsin to try to figure out what's causing our problem here was to go back and look at some work from the Elections Research Center. So I run the Center for Communication and Civic Renewal, but I'm lucky to be a fellow at the ERC as well, which is run by Barry Burden, a political scientist here at UW-Madison. And so we engaged in a panel study starting back in February of 2020 and going through the election and just after the election in 2020 in Wisconsin, but also in other states. We didn't do the panel in other states. We just did cross-sectional studies in some of those other states. But in the panel in Wisconsin, the actual vote was, in the neighborhood of just over half a point of an advantage for Joe Biden. The last survey we released had a much larger Biden advantage. We did this survey on the web using YouGov and their population propensity score matching strategy for sampling, and then applied YouGov's weights to that sample and had Biden getting 52.8% of the vote and Donald Trump 44% of the vote. So that was what we thought reality was right before the election, when reality was actually 49.6 for Biden and 48.9 for Trump. If we don't use their weights, we don't really improve much in the way of our estimation, although it seems as though the bigger, we didn't improve a ton. We improved a little bit by not using weights, but the ways that we really improved the most were in the row here that says limited to ongoing panelists from February. And so what YouGov did with us was we had a panel, and some folks sustained with us and kept engaging in our surveys all the way through the election. That ended up being 430 people. And that result was almost nailing Biden perfectly, 49.7 to his actual 49.6, and still a little bit of an undercount to Trump. 47.4, but a full 3.5 points higher than what we thought reality was. So the people who were in wave one of our panel and stuck with us pretty closely reflected reality. Whereas the refresh sample, the sample that kept getting added to get us back up to 650 or so participants over the intervening months of the election, pushed us in a direction to bias support toward Joe Biden and away from Donald Trump. And so what we're trying to figure out now is whether it's the case that Trump supporters became less willing to participate in these surveys over time, or if the sampling procedure caused us some kind of problem, or if there's some other explanation that we're not yet smart enough to figure out as to why it is that the new sample was systematically biased to favor Joe Biden, and the sample that we gathered early in the election season was one that was much, much closer to reflecting reality. Other things we tried to do that also get us pretty close to reality, if we limit the respondents to just those who also voted in 2016, we get the Biden result correct, so we don't overshoot Biden by 3 points. We're still undershooting Trump by that group. The structure of the data that did the best for Trump was limited to respondents who were interested in news most of the time. So the political interest question helped us do better on accurately estimating Donald Trump's vote, but it also caused us to miss Biden's vote and undercount Biden by just over a full point. And so none of these strategies get us as close as we might like to be to the actual result, but it certainly seems to be the case that one of the problems was the closer we got to the election, the bigger the discrepancy was between what we were learning from our polling and from what reality ended up being when all of the votes were counted on and in the days that came right after Election Day. So that's data that came from the Elections Research Center. The center I run also did that swing state sample I was discussing before, and across Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and North Carolina, we had an average of a +4 bias for Joe Biden. When we accounted for the likely voters in the same way that the Elections Research Center data, when we did it that same way, that bias decreased a bit. And when we waited to try to match party county level registration better, the bias decreased even more. And so there's something going on in the way that we're polling folks that is undercounting Republicans, and some of that I think has to do with Republican willingness, especially in rural and suburban areas, to be willing to engage in survey research. And so it's less an issue of what people are telling us when we have them on the web or on the phone, and more an issue, I think, of who's willing to engage in the survey to begin with. Other factors that have been discussed as reasons the polling was off was related to ticket splitting. So some folks, when they vote, will split their ticket between Republican and Democratic candidates. And everything I've talked about so far basically assumes that if you're voting for Donald Trump, you're also voting for the Republican House member and the Republican Senate candidate. And so one thing we did in our data was to try to understand, well, who is it that is splitting their ticket? And might that be a reason that we're getting some of this wrong? And so what you see here are data from the Center for Communication and Civic Renewal's panel of these different swing states. The left panel is about net news use. The further to the right you go on the x-axis, the further to the right, the more people are engaged in a homogeneous media diet. The more Republicans are watching Fox News and listening to conservative talk radio, the more Democrats are watching MSNBC and reading more liberal newspapers and blogs. And the further to the left in that figure, the more the Democrats are checking out some Fox News, the more Republicans are watching some MSNBC. And of course, you see the error bars get really big because there are not many people who have really diverse media diets that are extraordinarily driven by seeking out what the other side is doing. But those that are were more likely than not to split their ticket in terms of their net news use. Whereas folks who had a balanced media diet were right at about 10%. That's the 0 point on the x-axis there. And so most folks who have a slightly balanced or slightly mixed diet in either direction really weren't likely to split their tickets, but those who really had the diverse diets tended to, but this was a really small number of people. And the same logic was true for people's discussion networks. And so we also asked people about who they talk to about politics and whether the 3 people they talk to the most also have partisan affiliations that match that of the respondent. So the same logic to the graph, the further to the right, the more homogeneous the talk network, the further to the left, the more heterogeneous the talk network. And we found once again that the heterogeneity was more likely to predict split ticket voting. But in both of these cases, we found that this was roughly evenly distributed across Republicans and Democrats, and that the direction of the split was roughly even across Republicans and Democrats. And so it doesn't seem that these differences in the small number of folks who aren't engaging in party line voting don't seem to be the explanation for us as well. Ryan Clayson and John Barry Ryan, two political scientists in the United States, were more interested in whether social pressure was part of the problem. And so not quite a shy Trump voter explanation per se, but sort of a question that brings into sharp relief issues related to mass communication concepts like the spiral of silence and how we might estimate what opinion around us is like, and then gauge our own willingness to express opinion based on that estimation. And when in their surveys, they would ask direct questions about who you're going to vote for, they found a pretty big advantage for Biden, again, one that was larger than the election results actually ended up being. But then they also asked a couple of other questions. They asked, which candidate running for office do you think has the best impression, among folks in the public, and who has the worst impression? And people recognized there were more people who said that Trump had the worst impression than Biden. So then they investigated vote choice in the group of who had worst impression for Trump and worst impression for Biden. They've got a nice monkey cage article in the Washington Post that describes this research if you're interested in it, and basically found that the mix, again, was not sufficient to explain big differences in polling. And so it doesn't seem to be a shy voter. It doesn't seem to be people responding to social pressure, even if they have their own views about who the socially acceptable candidate is to vote for. It doesn't seem to be systematically affecting voters in one direction that would be biasing the results of our polls as compared to the results that actually come on election day. And so in the end, we sort of conclude that on the one hand, there are some issues of weighting to the surveys that we need to attend to. And we seem to be undersampling less educated men across racial categories. And it was the case, according to different exit polling in 2020, that less educated Black men, less educated Hispanic men were also slightly more likely to vote for Donald Trump than they were in 2016. And so systematically missing these groups might be one reason for the undercounting of Trump's vote. The partisan weighting by county registration seemed to matter, at least in our Wisconsin data. Shy Trump voting does not seem to be what's going wrong in polling, to the extent that things are going wrong. Social pressure and feelings of social pressure don't really seem to be what's going on, but willingness to be interviewed does seem to be a problem. And the Election Research Center evidence suggests that the closer we got to the election, the less willing we were able to gather supporters for Trump to engage in the survey to begin with. There's also an explanation related to the respondents' ability to forecast their vote choice as compared to favorability. So this explanation comes from Sam Wang at Princeton and the Princeton Election Consortium. And the argument there is that asking someone who they're going to vote for is a harder question than questions of favorability. And so if you ask whether you like a candidate more or less, or how favorable do you feel toward a candidate, those seem to be slightly more correlated with the actual result than the actual direct question about vote choice. And the explanation from that group is that one of the reasons is that it's harder for the respondent to forecast their vote choice because that's making a decision about the future as compared to how do you feel about this person now, which is always the way favorability questions tend to get asked. We don't ask, do you expect to feel favorable about Joe Biden in 2 months? We ask, tell us how favorable or unfavorably do you feel toward, this person or that person? And the evidence about ticket splitting and information diet seems to matter for how people choose to vote, but not in a way that systematically gives us the results that we saw in 2020, results where we consistently overestimated Joe Biden's vote and consistently underestimated Donald Trump's vote. It really seems, at least in the 2 months that we've had to kind of look at this evidence since 2020, are that we still have issues of weighting in surveys. We still have questions of people's ability to forecast the future, and we have questions of who it actually is we're able to get to participate in our surveys when we are trying to understand election polling in the United States. And so seeing as how we're working our way through the hour we have together, I'm happy to stop and respond to questions that I think Hernando is going to coordinate and organize. But thank you for your attention, and thanks in advance for your questions and comments.
Gracias, Mike. Pasamos entonces a una sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Si quieren pueden hacer sus preguntas en inglés. Si las hacen en español, yo con mucho gusto las traduzco. Y hay algunas preguntas que van a estar viniéndonos de los otros canales que también trataré de traducir en su momento. Entonces, con esto, ¿quién le gustaría comenzar con una pregunta para Mike? Bueno, voy a empezar entonces con una pregunta que nos viene de otro canal. Mike, what do you think was the real impact of the court's decision not to accept Texas' claim on the vote counting in other states?
Well, I think it made it really hard for partisan elites and elected officials to articulate a direct case that things really might change, right? It became a lot harder for Republicans to say, now we have a way to think about how we're counting the votes that might mean results in these other states are going to change. And so by not having that decision go their way, they were really kind of stuck in this weird limbo and this weird cross pressure of being able to say, well, there have been about 6 dozen court cases, and our side has lost nearly all of them. And all of the counts and all of the recounts, we continue to lose. And so the legitimate avenues to overturn this seem to be gone, but we can still complain about it. We can still engage in signaling and credit claiming and rhetorical work. But it seemed like the actual work to engage in a serious legal effort died then. There were legal efforts after that, but I wouldn't characterize them as serious or potential, or ones that had any potential to change things. To me, that's when the election was really over.
Thank you, Mike. I also had another question for you. And so you mentioned the sort of the less willingness of Republicans to be interviewed. And I know that you opened this as a question, but I'd like you to speculate on why could this be? Why could it be that Republicans are less willing to be interviewed?
So I think there are a few reasons, right? One reason is that most people don't associate polling with pollsters. They don't associate polling with people with some kind of social scientific training who are interested in understanding, the truth of a snapshot in time, and they don't think of it that way. They think of it as something the news media reports. And what they are told by most Republican lawmakers is that the news media are biased. The news media are not to be trusted. The news media are organizations that systematically favor the Democrats as compared to the Republicans. And that message has been a large part of Republican Party messaging for several decades. And President Trump brought it in some ways to another level of, in some cases, literally advocating violence against members of the news media, but also in his regular rhetoric of claiming broadly without specifics and usually without evidence on his side that the polls were wrong and that he was really in the lead and that his polls showed them that they were in the lead. And so there was a breeding of distrust that kind of shifted into overdrive, I think, about the news media. And I think that for some potential Trump voters, that is enough to not want to participate in things that they see the news media as engaging in. And I know in journalism studies, reporters are now sometimes chronicling how much more difficult it is to get Republican voters to just talk to them in stories. So not just talking to a pollster, but thinking of sharing their views with a group that they see as illegitimate, a group that they see as an enemy to the kind of life that they would prefer. And so I think part of it is that rhetorical strategy from the right. I think part of it is the reshuffling of where people are living. And as there's not quite a big sort happening, but the data from states like ours in Wisconsin, but also Ohio and Michigan suggests that Democratic votes are becoming more concentrated in large cities, and it's becoming harder with cell phone only or with broadband internet reach to get some of the places accurately in more rural parts of states like this one. So I think that also probably contributes to that as well. So I think some of it is probably an active choice to not want to help, and some of it is a harder to reach these groups because of where they live.
Thank you, Mike. Lorena, tienes la palabra.
Gracias. Hi, Mike. Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. And I'm interested particularly in this problem with sampling and the unwillingness of to respond from specific members of the electorate, right? Because we are starting to see some of these problems in some states in Mexico. And I think it is specific profile of a voter that will actually have an important impact on the measurement, right? And it's associated to a specific personality of a candidate or a leader, right, that we're trying to measure. So what do you think are possible solutions to explore in order to curtail these issues? Because we are seeing a rejection from these voters in particular. We see it like from a lot of López Obrador sympathizers, right? That they say, if you come from, I am the pollster for Reforma newspaper, and they say, some of them say, no, López Obrador hates Reforma, so we're not going to answer your questions, right? And they're excluded from the sample.
I think this is a really hard problem. One finding that came out of some of the survey work our group did was we asked our respondents how closely they felt to a bunch of different kinds of groups and political institutions. So how close do you feel toward the police, to your local news reporters, to lawmakers in your state of each party? But the thing that's really stood out to us was people in Wisconsin who live in the suburbs feel closer to rural Wisconsinites, those who live in rural areas, than rural Wisconsinites feel toward rural Wisconsinites. So there's this identity in the suburbs that is tied to your question in this way. So you'd mentioned at the beginning of your question, part of what's happening here is candidates are tying their own identities to these particular swaths of voters. And in Wisconsin, our previous governor, Scott Walker, had done that very well, kind of creating what my colleague Kathy Kramer calls the politics of resentment, and doing a really good job of saying to rural voters, I know what it means to work hard. Rural people are working hard and with their hands, and they're not getting the benefits that they're supposed to be getting from their government because the elitists in Madison, where the college is, and Milwaukee, where, which is a more racially diverse place, in the two large cities, they're taking all of the benefits that belong to you. And folks who lived in the suburbs of those cities seem to identify more with the rural perspective than the urban perspective. And Donald Trump had that same kind of argument. These elitists are getting all their things, and it's because politicians can be bought, but I'm rich, so I can't be bought. And so you can trust me, even though I'm completely unlike you in virtually every way. And so we see that there's something happening there. So what can we do about it? I don't really know. Kathy's argument in her subsequent work after her book is that we need to do more of an active job of listening, right? And so spending time in communities that we think are predisposed to oppose the work that we're doing, and instead of saying, here are all the things we're doing as reporters to try to shed light on what's happening in your community, or here are all the things that academics are trying to do to teach kids to come back to your community, just saying, instead just going and listening and saying, tell us about what you're interested in, tell us about your problems, tell us about what you care about, and not try to advance an agenda. So Kathy makes the argument that that kind of listening does some work with respect to those individuals' identities that might make them more receptive to future conversations. But this is all, qualitative work that's done at a really detailed level, and whether this scales up is, I don't know, but it's something that I think might be worth thinking about. Is, are there strategies to let people know you're willing to listen to them rather than shame them or persuade them or feed them facts that tell them their views are wrong, which isn't, I think, what reporters are doing, but is what I think politicians are doing when they try to communicate to these folks, might play into this. But part of the issue, again, I think, is that the leaders on one side of the United States, and as it sounds like maybe this is happening in Mexico too, are are equating the political opposition with the news, the political opposition with polling. And so that becomes much more difficult to disentangle as politics becomes more a part of our identities.
Una pregunta que nos llega de YouTube de Mario Riccardi. Do you know what kind of electoral behavior previously had those who watched both major networks during these elections? Could we call them rationals? And if we do, how large is that electoral segment? I mean, those who watched both major networks at the same time.
So if we define major networks as the mainstream news, so in the United States, that would be network television, ABC, NBC, and CBS, we wouldn't see huge differences in partisan voting. If we consider national news in terms of national cable political news and think about Fox News and MSNBC and those more ideologically slanted, so of course, there's a high association between where people selectively expose themselves to news and the party they vote for. And for that group that is more omnivorous, as Stephanie Edgerly of Northwestern says, the media omnivores who just want all the content that they can get, they seem to be the ones who are splitting their ticket more. So it may be rational. It may be a preference for moderation. It may be neither of those things. And so I don't know that we would call it rational, but it's not a high percentage of people who have the most diverse media diets. Most folks have a modestly balanced diet, and really in the United States, a Pew study recently showed about 20% of partisans really live in the filter bubbles. But then that means there's 80% of partisans who aren't. But not many of those are spending tons of time with the other side. So that's a small group of 4 or 5%. But did I get to all of the elements of that question, or did I skip one?
I think you did. And,
okay.
And there's another question, this one from Rene Bautista, also from YouTube. Do you think survey weighting based on demographic characteristics, which may be more stable over time, and urbanicity are more promising solutions to adjust state-level surveys? Or is it psychographic segmentation based on subjective traits, which may have lower reliability?
I think I would say yes, but to all. But I think that it depends upon the goal of what we're trying to do. If what we're trying to do is explain behavior, then I think that the first option of weighting to demographics is the strongest. If we're trying to predict an election result, we're never perfectly sure if that weighting is going to reflect voter turnout. We can tell you how it reflects the last election's voter turnout, but this caused us a problem in 2016 when we did not expect less educated white men, especially those with more libertarian preferences who had not participated before, to show up in larger numbers in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And so if the purpose is predictive, I think we're going to have more luck with psychographic variables that might be more fleeting, but might be important now. And if we're trying to explain in a way that's comparable over time, then I would suggest the weighting in terms of demographics. That might be unsatisfying, but I think that's, to me, it relates most to the purpose of the explanation we want to give.
Bueno, creo que con esto hemos culminado nuestro tiempo y las preguntas que teníamos. Again, Mike, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And muchas gracias a todos, a todas por venir hoy a esta sesión de la Cátedra Internacional de Opinión Pública. Los esperamos en nuestros próximos eventos.
Boletín CIOP. El viernes 12 de marzo, de 12 a 14 horas, se realizará la cuarta sesión del Seminario de Opinión Pública con la conferencia del Dr. Claudio Castro, titulada Experiencias de voto nulo, el caso del Estado de Veracruz. Para mayor información y contenido de la Cátedra Internacional de Opinión Pública, suscríbete a nuestro canal y síguenos en nuestras redes.